It's funny how the cold can creep into your bones before you even realize it. I always thought I was used to it. Search and rescue volunteers don't exactly get the luxury of warm office jobs, but that January night was something else. The snowstorm had rolled in fast and heavy, and the mountain was eerily silent except for the crunch of my snowshoes and the occasional hiss of wind cutting through the trees. We were looking for a guy named Evan Matthews, early 30s, experienced hiker, decided to tackle a solo snowshoe trek during one of the worst winters we'd had in years. His wife called us after he didn't check in for 2 days. By the time we got the call, the snow was already waist-deep in some spots, and the forecast promised it would get worse. I was assigned to Sector C, a stretch of forest near a ridge notorious for disorienting hikers. It didn't help that the storm had wiped out most of the tracks we could have followed. Hours into the search, I was tired, cold, and increasingly sure we weren't going to find Evan alive. Then I found the first clue. It was a snowshoe, half buried in a drift. Nearby, there were faint footprints, bare feet, which made no sense in this weather. They led in a tight circle, then veered off toward the thicker woods. I radioed it in, but static garbled the response. I should have waited for backup, but something about those tracks pulled me forward. The trees grew denser, their branches sagging under the weight of the snow. As I followed the footprints, I started noticing strange things. Small carvings in the bark, symbols I didn't recognize, kept appearing every few trees. Bits of torn fabric dangled from branches, fluttering weakly in the wind. My gut twisted, but I told myself it was just the cold and exhaustion playing tricks. Then I found him. Evan was kneeling in the snow, his back to me. His head was bowed, and his arms hung limp at his sides. For a second, I thought he was alive, just resting. But when I got closer, I saw the frost coating his skin, the icicles clinging to his eyelashes. He was frozen solid, like some macabre statue. Clutched in his hands was a notebook, its pages stiff with frost. I pried it free and flipped through it with numb fingers. The writing started off normal, notes about his route, weather conditions, and the view. But the later entries, they were frantic, scrawled in barely legible handwriting. They're watching me. I hear them whispering when the wind blows. I can't stop walking in circles. Every path leads back to the same place. The frost shepherd is here. He's coming for me. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint sound, a low, mournful wail. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to retrace my steps, but the storm had obliterated the trail. The carvings on the trees seemed to multiply, and the footprints, Evan's footprints, started showing up ahead of me, as if I were following him all over again. The cold was relentless. My limbs felt heavy, my breath shallow. Panic clawed at my chest as I realized I was walking in circles, just like Evan. Every path led me back to his frozen body, kneeling in the snow. At one point, I dropped to my knees, exhausted and trembling. That's when I heard it again, the voice. It wasn't the wind this time, it was clearer, closer. A soft, almost kind whisper, "Rest now." I don't know how long I lay there, but I remember closing my eyes, the snow drifting down to cover me like a blanket. I thought of Evan, of his wife waiting at home, of how easily this job could go from heroic to tragic in a heartbeat. And then darkness. When I woke up, I was in the hospital. They said another team found me near the trailhead, unconscious and hypothermic. They didn't find Evan, and when I showed them the notebook, the pages were blank. I quit search and rescue after that. The mountains don't let go of their secrets easily, and I've learned not to ask too many questions. But every now and then, when the wind howls in the dead of winter, I swear I hear whispers in the air, soft and kind, calling me back. Winter nights on the highway are bleak. The cold seems to seep through every layer, no matter how many you wear, and the darkness stretches on forever, broken only by the faint glow of headlights. I'd been driving this route for years as part of my job at the regional bus service, but that January night still lingers in my memory like a bad dream I can't shake. It started like any other late-night run. The snow had started falling earlier in the day, light at first but growing heavier as the evening wore on. By the time I pulled out of the station, it was a full-blown snowstorm. Visibility was awful, and the road was a slick mess of ice and slush. My usual passengers, a mix of weary travelers and locals, were bundled up in their seats, most of them dozing off or staring out the frosted windows. Everything was fine until we reached the stretch of highway near Pine Hollow. It's a desolate area, just trees and snow as far as the eye can see. That's when I saw the car. It was off to the side of the road, hazard lights blinking weakly through the snow. I slowed the bus and pulled over, my breath fogging up the windshield as I leaned forward to get a better look. There were 4 people standing near the car, 2 adults and 2 kids. They were dressed in old-fashioned winter clothes, the kind you'd see in black and white photographs. Heavy coats, wool hats, scarves that looked like they'd been knitted by hand. The man raised his hand in a wave, his face pale and tight with worry. I couldn't just leave them out there, not in this weather. I opened the door, and they climbed aboard, shaking snow off their clothes. The woman smiled at me, her cheeks rosy from the cold. "Thank you so much," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Our car broke down, and we've been out here for hours." "No problem," I said, glancing at the kids. They were quiet, clutching each other's hands as they stared at the floor. "Where are you headed?" "Home," the man said. "Just down the road." I nodded and started driving again, the bus groaning as it crawled through the snow. The family took seats near the middle, and I kept glancing at them in the mirror. Something about them felt off. The way they sat so still, the way their breath didn't fog up the air like everyone else's. I shook it off, chalking it up to the long night and the bad weather. After about 15 minutes, I noticed something strange. The other passengers, all 6 of them, were completely silent. No rustling of jackets, no quiet conversations, no muffled coughs. I glanced in the mirror again and felt my stomach drop. They were all staring straight ahead, eyes wide and unblinking. I'd never felt so cold in my life. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I fought the urge to pull over and run. Instead, I focused on the road, the snow swallowing the bus's headlights in a swirling white void. "Almost there," the man said suddenly. His voice made me jump. "Where exactly are you headed?" I asked, my voice sounding shaky even to me. "Pine Hollow Cemetery," he replied. I turned my head sharply to look at him, but the seat was empty. So were the seats where the woman and children had been sitting. My heart pounded as I slammed on the brakes, the bus skidding slightly before coming to a stop. I turned on the interior lights, but there was no sign of them. Just empty seats and damp patches of melted snow where they'd been sitting. The other passengers began to stir, blinking and looking around as if waking from a deep sleep. One of them, an older man in a heavy coat, frowned at me. "Why'd we stop?" he asked. I didn't know what to say. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. "Thought I saw something," I mumbled, my voice barely audible. The rest of the drive passed in a blur. When I finally pulled into the station, I sat there for a long time after everyone else had disembarked, staring at the damp spots on the seats. The next morning, I couldn't resist driving back to the spot where I'd picked up the family. The car was still there, buried in snow, its windows frosted over. But when I wiped the glass, my stomach turned. Inside were 4 skeletons, dressed in the same old-fashioned winter clothes. The man was still gripping the wheel, his bony hand raised in a frozen wave. I quit the bus service a week later. I told myself it was just stress, just exhaustion, but deep down I knew better. Some nights, when I'm driving alone and the snow starts to fall, I catch myself glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see them sitting there, watching me with unblinking eyes. They called it the Lodge of Long Shadows, and it sat at the edge of Black Ridge, surrounded by dense forest and heavy silence. For years, it had been the kind of place that locals whispered about but never visited. But when my friends dared me to spend the weekend there, I couldn't resist. It was just an old, abandoned hunting lodge, right? What could go wrong? I arrived on a Friday evening, the winter sun setting low behind the trees. Snow crunched under my boots as I made my way up the winding path. The lodge loomed ahead, its dark wood exterior weathered and warped, icicles clinging to the eaves like jagged teeth. The windows were mostly intact, though several panes were frosted over or cracked, and the front door hung slightly ajar, as if waiting for me. The inside was colder than I expected. My breath fogged the air as I stepped into the main hall, flashlight sweeping over peeling wallpaper, dusty furniture, and a massive stone fireplace that dominated one wall. A thick layer of grime coated everything, and cobwebs hung in the corners like tattered curtains. Still, it wasn't as creepy as I'd anticipated. Just old and empty. I set up my gear near the fireplace, a sleeping bag, a few snacks, and a portable heater. My phone had no signal, but that was no surprise. I'd told my friends I'd record everything, so I propped up my camera on a tripod and hit record. The first night was uneventful. The wind howled outside, and the lodge creaked and groaned, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. I was almost disappointed. I woke up a few times during the night, convinced I'd heard footsteps or faint whispers, but when I sat up and listened, all I could hear was the wind. The second day was when things started to get strange. I woke up to find my sleeping bag covered in frost, despite the heater running all night. My camera had stopped recording after only a few hours, its battery inexplicably drained. When I stepped outside to check the area, I noticed something odd. There were tracks in the snow, circling the lodge. They were large and deep, but they didn't look like boot prints. More like claws. I told myself it was just a bear or some other animal, but unease settled in my chest like a weight. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked out a window, the forest seemed darker, the shadows longer. By evening, the sense of isolation was overwhelming. That night, I built a fire in the hearth and huddled close, my flashlight flickering weakly, as if the batteries were dying. I just started to drift off when I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere inside the lodge. My heart pounded as I grabbed the flashlight and scanned the room. The beam of light landed on the doorway leading to the kitchen, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement. "Hello!" I called, my voice trembling. Silence. I edged toward the doorway, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The kitchen was empty, but the back door was wide open, snow blowing in across the floor. I shut it quickly, locking the flimsy latch, and returned to the main hall, every nerve in my body screaming at me to leave. But the storm outside had worsened, and the thought of trekking through the woods in the dark was just as terrifying as staying. The whispers started around midnight. Faint at first, like the wind, but soon they grew louder, more distinct. They were coming from upstairs. I didn't want to go, but something compelled me. The flashlight's beam danced across the walls as I climbed the creaking staircase, each step feeling like it might give way beneath me. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices speaking words I couldn't understand. They led me to a door at the end of the hall, its surface scarred with deep, claw-like marks. I hesitated, hand hovering over the doorknob. Then, with a deep breath, I turned it and pushed the door open. The room beyond was empty, but the temperature plummeted as soon as I stepped inside. My breath fogged the air, and frost spread across the floor in intricate patterns. At the center of the room stood a single chair, and on it sat a journal, its leather cover cracked with age. I opened it with trembling hands. The entries were scrawled in messy, frantic handwriting, describing strange occurrences, footsteps, whispers, shadows moving in the corners of the lodge. The final entry made my blood run cold. It won't let me leave. It watches from the shadows, always waiting. I'm not alone here. A sudden sound behind me made me spin around. The doorway was empty, but the shadows in the hall seemed to shift and writhe as if alive. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and I bolted, stumbling down the stairs and out into the storm without even grabbing my gear. I didn't stop running until I reached the road, where a passing snowplow driver found me and gave me a ride back to town. I tried to explain what had happened, but he just shook his head. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. "People who go to that lodge don't usually come back." I don't know what I saw in the Lodge of Long Shadows, but I know one thing for sure. Some places are abandoned for a reason. And whatever lives there, it's still watching.